Racist cop Harasses black female FBI agent faces instant karma when he learns the truth. It was a warm afternoon in the bustling city of Atlanta. FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a brilliant and highly respected black woman, was driving back to her office after wrapping up an intense investigation. She had spent months working on a high-profile case, tracking a dangerous drug cartel, and she was now on the verge of a breakthrough. Despite the exhaustion from long hours and relentless pressure, Tara felt a deep sense of pride in her work. Being one of the few black women in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency wasn't easy, but she had earned her place. As she navigated through the city streets, her mind raced with the latest developments in the case. She was replaying the most recent intel in her head when suddenly, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Surprised, she glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what she could have possibly done wrong. A police car rolled up behind her, and a tall white officer with a stern expression stepped out. His hand rested casually on the holster of his gun as he approached her window. Tara, keeping her composure, rolled it down and reached for her FBI badge, prepared to identify herself. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked politely. The officer's name tag read Daniels, but he barely acknowledged her greeting. "License and registration," he barked, his tone curt and dismissive. Tara was taken aback by his attitude but remained professional. "I'm an FBI agent. Here's my badge," she said, holding it up for him to see. Daniels gave it a fleeting glance before frowning. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his voice laced with impatience. A knot formed in Tara's stomach. Something was off. She had encountered difficult officers before, but there was something different about Daniels. His cold, dismissive demeanor and refusal to acknowledge her authority as a federal agent sent a chill down her spine. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. I'm on official duty," she reiterated, keeping her voice calm in an effort to de-escalate the situation. Daniels narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he ordered sharply, "Step out of the vehicle." Tara stared at him in shock. "Excuse me, are you deaf?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Daniels snapped, his voice rising enough to draw the attention of nearby pedestrians. Tara hesitated. She knew her rights, and she knew this wasn't right. There was no valid reason for her to be pulled over, let alone be forced to exit her car. Yet, she could feel the situation spiraling rapidly out of control. She had been trained to handle high-pressure scenarios, but this felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the underlying racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "Officer, I'm complying with your request, but I need you to understand that I am an FBI agent," she stated firmly, her tone measured. Daniel's face twisted with disdain as he leaned closer to her window. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll drag you out myself." Tara's pulse quickened. Taking a deep breath, she slowly reached for the door handle, carefully stepping out with her hands visible. By now, people had stopped to watch, murmuring among themselves. Daniels wasted no time. He grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her against the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara protested, a mixture of anger and disbelief in her voice. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Daniels sneered, twisting her arm behind her back. "You think you can just flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" Tara winced as the cold metal of the handcuffs clamped tightly around her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just humiliating. It was an outright abuse of power. As a federal agent, she had jurisdiction over cases far more significant than a routine traffic stop. Yet here she was, being treated like a common criminal simply because Officer Daniels refused to acknowledge her authority. By now, several bystanders had their phones out, recording the scene. Some whispered in shock, while others exchanged uneasy glances. But no one intervened. No one challenged the officer's actions. Tara's face burned with a mix of fury and humiliation, but she kept her head high. She had done nothing wrong, and she refused to let this officer break her spirit. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," she said firmly, though there was a slight tremble in her voice from the anger simmering inside her. "Shut your mouth," Daniels snapped. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something. You're not above the law." Tara's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, but she also had to find a way to get out of this situation without making it worse. Would her colleagues believe her if she told them? Arrested for no reason while on duty? It was almost unthinkable. Daniels yanked her toward his patrol car, ignoring her every attempt to reason with him. As he forced her inside, she caught a glimpse of the onlookers, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others still recording. As the door slammed shut, Tara took a slow, steady breath. She had faced difficult situations before, but this was different. This felt personal. Daniels had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let him get away with it. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Tara's mind raced. This was far from over. Officer Daniels clearly had a personal vendetta, and it was directed squarely at her. But why? Was it because she was a black woman? Or did he simply believe he could assert his power over her without facing any repercussions? Either way, it didn't matter at this moment. What mattered was how she would handle the situation. As they drove, Tara forced herself to stay composed. She had been trained to remain calm under pressure, and right now, she needed every ounce of that discipline. Her first instinct was to grab her phone and contact her supervisor, but with her hands restrained behind her back, that was impossible. She briefly considered asking Daniels to loosen the cuffs, but judging by his demeanor earlier, she doubted he would comply. Daniels glanced at her through the rearview mirror, a smug expression on his face. "You really thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, huh?" He scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. Tara narrowed her eyes. "I'm not pretending. I am a federal agent, and you're making a serious mistake." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you are, and I'm the chief of police." His mocking tone made Tara's blood boil, but she bit her tongue, refusing to take the bait. Engaging with him further was pointless. The car came to a stop in front of a small, older police station on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the usual precinct she was familiar with. This place looked outdated, rarely used. A sinking feeling settled in Tara's stomach. Daniels hadn't taken her to the main station. He had brought her somewhere off the radar, likely to avoid any oversight from his superiors or anyone from the FBI. He stepped out of the car, then yanked the door open and grabbed her arm roughly, hauling her out. "Move, agent," he sneered, deliberately emphasizing the title as if it were a joke. Tara winced as he shoved her toward the station entrance. She fought to remain calm, but the mix of anger and humiliation churned inside her. She had faced many challenges in her career, grueling training, high-stakes field operations, but nothing had prepared her for this level of blatant disrespect. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about being diminished because of her race, her gender, and her authority. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. A few officers sat at their desks, barely glancing up as Daniels led her past the front desk. Tara noticed the indifference in their expressions, the complete lack of surprise. This wasn't out of the ordinary for them. It was a chilling realization. No one here was going to step in. She was on her own. Daniels shoved her into a dimly lit interrogation room, slamming the door shut behind them. The space was bare, containing only a metal table and 2 chairs. He forced her into one of the chairs, leaving the handcuffs on. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, pacing back and forth in front of her. "I don't care who you claim to be. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Tara met his glare, refusing to back down. "You're violating my rights. You have no legal grounds to detain me. And when this is over, you will answer for this." Daniel stopped pacing and leaned in close, his face just inches from hers. "Is that a threat, agent?" he asked, his voice low and taunting. Tara didn't flinch. "It's a promise." He studied her for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "You really think that badge makes you special, don't you? Like you're above the law?" He straightened up, a smirk tugging at his lips. Well, guess what? You're in my house now. Tara could feel the tension in the room thickening, but she held his gaze, unwavering. I've dealt with bigger threats than you, Officer Daniels. You won't get away with this. Daniels' smirk widened. We'll see about that, he muttered before turning on his heel and walking out of the room, leaving her alone. As the door closed behind him, Tara exhaled slowly. She needed a plan, fast. There was no one in this station she could trust, and she was certain Daniels would do everything in his power to keep her cut off from the outside world. Her mind raced through possibilities. There had to be a way out of this. She scanned the room, searching for anything that might help. A small window near the ceiling let in faint light, but it was too high to reach. The door was locked from the outside. Her badge was still tucked inside her jacket pocket, but with her hands bound, she couldn't retrieve it. Minutes passed, and her frustration grew. She wasn't used to feeling powerless. She had always been the one in control, the one making arrests, not the one sitting in cuffs. The shift in power was unsettling, but she wouldn't let it break her. Suddenly, the door swung open. Another officer stepped in, a younger man, likely in his early 30s. His posture was tense, and his expression held uncertainty. He glanced at her, then at the file in his hands before speaking. Agent Johnson, he began, his voice cautious. I was told to process you for holding, but... He hesitated, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I just want to say, I'm sorry about all of this. Tara's eyes locked onto his. His tone lacked the hostility she had come to expect. He didn't carry the same arrogance as Daniels. Maybe, just maybe, he could be an ally. Before she could respond, Daniels appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening. He shot the younger officer a withering glare. What are you waiting for? Get her processed, he barked, his tone sharp with irritation. The younger officer, Mitchell, according to his badge, hesitated. His discomfort was obvious, but after a moment, he gave a reluctant nod. Yes, sir. Daniels lingered for a few seconds, his gaze flickering between Tara and Mitchell, as if assessing the interaction. Then, with one final glare, he turned and walked away. Tara's eyes met Mitchell's again. She had a feeling that Mitchell might be the key to getting out of this situation. Tara watched him closely, balancing between hope and caution. He seemed uneasy, maybe even sympathetic, but she couldn't be certain. She knew from experience that people in his position often hesitated when put under pressure, especially from someone like Daniels. Still, she couldn't afford to let any opportunity slip through her fingers. Mitchell cleared his throat awkwardly, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. I need some information, he said, his voice slightly unsteady. Just routine name, date of birth, that sort of thing. Tara studied him carefully. His reluctance was obvious in the way his eyes kept flicking toward the door, as if expecting Daniels to barge in at any moment. You already know who I am, she replied, her tone calm but firm. And you know this isn't right. Mitchell's hand froze mid-scribble. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in his expression. Guilt, perhaps, but he quickly masked it with a forced sense of duty. He looked down at his notepad, avoiding her gaze. I don't make the rules, he muttered under his breath. Tara leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but insistent. Maybe not, but you do decide whether or not to follow orders that you know are wrong. Mitchell hesitated again, his pen trembling slightly. The air in the small interrogation room was thick with tension, and Tara could see the internal struggle on his face. She had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when someone was wrestling with their conscience. I can help you, Mitchell, she said, her tone softening just enough. But first, you have to help me. Mitchell glanced around nervously before looking back at her. He let out a deep sigh, running a hand through his hair. This isn't how things are supposed to go, he muttered, almost to himself. I know something's not right, but Daniels, he's the senior officer. I can't just... Daniels is abusing his authority, Tara interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. You know that, and if you don't stop it now, you're just as responsible. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The weight of her words lingered in the air. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but before he could speak, the door to the interrogation room burst open. Daniels stormed in, his expression cold and furious. "What's taking so damn long?" he snapped, glaring at Mitchell. "She's a simple perp, not a damn mystery to solve." Mitchell shot up from his chair, visibly startled. I was just getting the basic information, sir." Daniels sneered at him, unimpressed. "Get her into holding already. We don't have all day." Mitchell nodded quickly, shoving his notepad back into his pocket. He avoided looking at Tara as he stood, motioning for her to follow him. But Tara wasn't done. She knew this might be her only chance to get through to him, and she refused to let fear silence her. "You're making a mistake, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is going to come back on you. I guarantee it." Daniels let out a harsh, bitter laugh, the sound bouncing off the walls. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart. But in this town, nobody gives a damn about your so-called authority. You think that shiny FBI badge makes you untouchable?" He smirked. "Think again." Tara held his gaze, refusing to waver. "I don't need to be untouchable," she said coolly. "I just need the right people to see what you've done. And trust me, they will." For a split second, something flickered in Daniel's eyes. Uncertainty. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by his usual smug arrogance. He waved his hand dismissively at Mitchell. "Get her out of my sight," he snapped. Mitchell, clearly rattled, stepped forward and grabbed Tara's arm, leading her down a narrow hallway. The tension between them was palpable. She could sense that he was still struggling with what had just happened, but he remained silent. They reached a small holding cell at the end of the hallway. Mitchell unlocked the door and gestured for her to step inside. Tara hesitated for a moment, then looked him directly in the eye. "You still have a choice," she said quietly. "You don't have to go along with this." Mitchell's shoulders sagged slightly. He muttered something under his breath, too low for Tara to hear, before shutting the cell door behind her and walking away. Tara sat on the cold metal bench inside the cell, taking a slow, measured breath. The walls felt like they were closing in, but she forced herself to stay level-headed. Panic wouldn't help her now. The hours dragged on as she sat in silence, her thoughts simmering. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting against the injustice that had led her here in the first place. The abuse of power, the racism, the humiliation. It all burned inside her like a fire she couldn't put out. Then, suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Tara tensed, preparing herself. To her surprise, it wasn't Daniels who appeared at the door of her cell. Mitchell glanced around anxiously, checking to see if anyone else was nearby before swiftly unlocking the door. Tara's heart pounded as he motioned for her to follow. "What are you doing?" she whispered, eyes wide with confusion. Mitchell shot a quick look over his shoulder, his face pale with tension. "I'm getting you out of here, but we don't have much time."
Tara hesitated.
Could she really trust him? But she knew she didn't have many options. If there was even a small chance he was being sincere, she had to take it. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell and down the dimly lit hallway. They moved quickly, avoiding the main areas where other officers might be. Her heart pounded in her chest as they reached the back exit. Mitchell paused, pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door. "This is your chance," he said quietly, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Get out of here before Daniels catches on." Tara's mind raced. Was this a trap? Could she really trust him? This entire ordeal had been a nightmare, and after everything she had been through, it was hard to believe anyone in that precinct would actually help her. Mitchell glanced nervously at his watch. "We don't have much time," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. His anxiety was obvious. His eyes darted around, as if expecting Daniels to appear at any moment. Tara took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stay, especially not after what Daniels had done, but running would only complicate things. She was an FBI agent, after all. Vanishing from a police station would raise far too many questions. She was trapped between two impossible choices. The system she had once trusted had turned against her, and now she had to decide quickly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Mitchell hesitated. He opened his mouth to respond but quickly shut it, struggling for words. His expression flickered with guilt and desperation. "Because it's wrong," he finally muttered. "What Daniels is doing, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. He's going to pay for it one way or another, but right now, if you stay, you're the one who's going to suffer. You have to get out of here before it's too late." Tara searched his face, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, like he was begging her to believe him. But could she? Was he really trying to help? Or was he just covering himself? She couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up, but the clock was ticking, and she didn't have time to second guess. If Mitchell was telling the truth, staying would only make things worse. If Daniels came back and found her still locked up, there was no telling what he would do next. She knew better than to underestimate a man like him, a man consumed by power and hate. Taking a leap of faith, she nodded and stepped toward the door. "All right," she whispered. "Let's go." Relief flashed across Mitchell's face as he quickly ushered her outside. The crisp night air hit her skin, sharp and invigorating. For the first time in hours, she felt the faintest spark of hope. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they slipped through the alley behind the precinct. Tara's senses were razor-sharp. Every rustle of the wind, every distant footstep sent a fresh wave of adrenaline surging through her veins. She was trained for situations like this, but it was different when the danger came from those sworn to uphold the law. Knowing that Daniels could be right behind them at any moment was enough to set her nerves on edge. Mitchell led her to a battered old car parked near the end of the alley. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly, before unlocking the passenger door. "Get in," he murmured, glancing around nervously. Tara slid into the seat, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. Mitchell jumped in on the driver's side and started the engine. The low rumble of the car seemed deafening in the quiet night. As they pulled away from the precinct, the silence inside the car was suffocating. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them both. Tara couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unease building inside her. They had escaped for now, but they weren't safe. Not yet. Daniels wouldn't let this go. He was the type of man who thrived on control, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. Finally, Tara broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Mitchell kept his eyes locked on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Someplace safe," he said. "Somewhere Daniels won't find you." Tara narrowed her eyes, skepticism creeping back in. "And then what? Can't just run. You know that. I have to deal with this." Mitchell cast her a quick glance, his jaw tight. "I know, but you need time. Time to figure out your next move. Time to get enough evidence to bring him down. If you stay here, Daniels will bury you before you even get the chance." Tara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She hated the idea of running, but Mitchell had a point. She needed more information, something concrete that would expose Daniels for what he was. But where would she even start? And after what had happened, how could she trust anyone in that precinct? The car sped through the empty streets, city lights flickering past in a blur. Tara stared out the window, deep in thought. She needed to contact her team at the FBI, but Daniels had taken her phone back at the precinct. Her hands clenched into fists, one problem after another. "Mitchell," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "We need to stop. I need a phone." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "We can't stop yet. It's too risky." Tara's jaw tightened. "I can't do this blind. I need to talk to my people. I need backup. If we're going to take Daniels down, I can't be working in the dark," Tara said firmly. Mitchell exhaled sharply, clearly struggling with the decision. After a brief silence, he relented. "There's a gas station a few miles ahead. We'll stop there. You can make your call, but we have to be quick." If Daniels is onto us, we don't have much time. Tara gave a curt nod, already planning her next move. She knew exactly who to contact. A colleague who owed her a favor, someone she could rely on to act swiftly and discreetly. As they approached the gas station, Mitchell pulled into the dimly lit lot, parking near the side. Tara scanned the area instinctively, her training kicking in. Every movement, every shadow could mean danger. She stepped out of the car cautiously, making her way to the payphone while Mitchell remained inside, keeping watch. She picked up the receiver and quickly dialed the memorized number, silently praying that her contact would answer. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice finally came through. "Tara? Is that you?" Relief washed over her, but she had no time to waste. "Yeah, it's me," she whispered urgently. "I'm in trouble, and I need your help. Daniels is dirty. He arrested me without cause, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." A pause followed, then the voice of her colleague, Agent Jackson, came through, his tone serious. "All right, calm down. Where are you right now?" "I'm outside a gas station on the outskirts of town. I managed to escape with the help of an officer, Mitchell, but I don't know how much time we have before Daniels realizes I'm gone. He's dangerous, Jackson. We need to act fast." Jackson's voice turned grave. "Okay, listen. We'll send backup, but you need to stay low until we get to you. Do you trust this Mitchell guy?" Tara glanced toward the car. Mitchell sat stiffly in the driver's seat, fingers tapping anxiously against the steering wheel, his eyes darting around the parking lot. She hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but he got me out of that precinct, and right now he's all I've got." Jackson let out a slow breath. "All right, I'll pull some strings and get a team to your location. But you need to be careful. Daniels won't go down quietly. If he figures out you're working against him, things could get ugly." Tara nodded, though Jackson couldn't see her. "I understand. I'll keep moving until backup arrives. Don't let me down, Jackson. You know I won't. Stay safe, Tara." The line went dead. Tara set the receiver down, her mind racing. There was a plan now, backup was coming. She wasn't out of danger yet, but at least she had a fighting chance. Hurrying back to the car, she slipped into the passenger seat. Mitchell looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" "For now," Tara replied. "I made the call. My team is sending backup, but we can't stay here. Daniels will figure out I'm missing soon, and when he does, he'll come after us." Mitchell nodded without hesitation. Shifting the car into gear, he pulled out of the lot and back onto the road. The night stretched out before them, dark and unnervingly silent. As they sped through the city streets, Tara kept a close watch on the side mirrors, searching for any signs of pursuit. So far, they seemed to be in the clear. The tension between them thickened with every passing minute. Tara replayed the night's events over and over in her mind. Anger simmered beneath her skin. The humiliation, the blatant abuse of power. Daniel's smug face as he slapped the cuffs on her still burned in her memory. How could a man like that hold any authority? She shifted her gaze to Mitchell, who had been silent since they left the gas station. In the dim glow of the dashboard, she could see the strain on his face. He looked exhausted, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. Whatever his reasons, he had chosen to help her, and that counted for something. "You didn't have to do this," Tara said suddenly, her voice softer now. Mitchell let out a breath, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I did," he murmured. "I couldn't just sit back and watch him get away with it. Daniels has been corrupt for years, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to him. He's got the whole precinct under his thumb. I knew that if I didn't do something, you'd end up taking the fall for his mess." Tara studied him closely. "Why now?" she asked. "Why help me?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the road ahead. "Because I've seen what happens to the people who cross him. I know what he does to anyone who threatens his control. And you weren't just another person he could silence. You're an FBI agent. If he took you down, it would send a message that even people with power, with authority, aren't safe from him. I couldn't let that happen." Tara exhaled slowly, his words settling heavily in her mind. Daniels hadn't just wanted to humiliate her. He had wanted to make an example of her, to show that no one, no matter their rank, could challenge him and walk away unscathed. But Tara wasn't someone who could be broken. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let a corrupt, power-hungry cop like Daniels strip that away from her. She would see this through, no matter what it took. As they continued down the road, the city lights faded behind them, giving way to the emptiness of the outskirts. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of what was to come. The real fight had only just begun. The streets grew narrower, the lights becoming fewer and farther between. Mitchell had deliberately taken them off the main roads, likely in an attempt to avoid being tracked. But Tara knew it was only a matter of time before Daniels realized they were gone. Soon, the entire precinct would be searching for them. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell pulled into a small, secluded parking lot at the edge of a dense forest. The area was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered buildings in the distance. Cutting the engine, he turned to Tara, his expression grim. "We'll wait here until your team arrives," he said quietly. "It's out of the way, and Daniels won't think to look here, at least not right away." Tara scanned the empty lot, her instincts urging her to stay alert. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound magnified in the eerie silence. Unease settled in her stomach, but for now, this was the best option they had. She nodded and leaned back in her seat, her thoughts racing. They were safe for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Daniels wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and that meant they had to stay one step ahead. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the dark woods surrounding them. "We should stay quiet," he muttered. "If anyone's following us, we don't want to give them any reason to notice." Tara nodded in agreement. They had come too far to risk being caught now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every sound outside, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified in the stillness of the night. Tara's mind churned, strategizing her next move. Jackson's team would arrive soon, but running and hiding wasn't enough. She had to make sure Daniels was held accountable for everything he had done. But to do that, she needed more than just backup. She needed proof, something undeniable that would expose Daniels as the corrupt officer he was. The occasional creak of branches in the wind was the only disturbance in the night. Tara sat in the darkness of the car, the faint glow of the dashboard casting a dim light over their tense faces. Mitchell kept glancing around anxiously, his eyes shifting from the rearview mirror to the side windows, scanning for any sign of approaching headlights. Tara noticed his unease, though she couldn't blame him. They were both running from a man who held unchecked power, a man who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this," Mitchell muttered, finally breaking the silence. "Daniels has always been a snake, but I never thought he'd go this far." Tara turned to him, her voice calm but resolute. "He's more than just a snake. Daniels thrives on intimidation, on controlling everyone around him. But his time is running out. I'm going to make sure of that." Mitchell nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "I get that you want to take him down, but he's got the entire department wrapped around his finger. Most of them are too scared to speak up. They know what happens to anyone who crosses him."
Tara sigid.
She understood the fear Daniels instilled in people. She had seen it firsthand when he threw his weight around like he was untouchable. But this wasn't just about fear. It was about justice. Daniels had gone too far, and now he was trying to take her down to cover his tracks. She wouldn't let him get away with it. "What we need is solid evidence," Tara said, thinking aloud. "Something undeniable that proves he's been abusing his power. Something that can't just be dismissed." Mitchell frowned, looking unconvinced. Easier said than done. Daniels isn't sloppy. He covers his tracks well. And no one in the precinct is going to help us. They're all too afraid of what he'll do if they talk. Tara's mind raced. Mitchell was right. Taking down Daniels wouldn't be easy, especially when most of the officers either supported him or were too terrified to go against him. But she also knew that men like Daniels always made mistakes. It was just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. "There has to be something," she murmured, more to herself than to Mitchell. A paper trail, an eyewitness, anything. Mitchell remained silent, staring out the windshield. The tension in the car was thick, both of them lost in their thoughts. Then suddenly Tara's phone buzzed. Her heart pounded as she grabbed it, the screen lighting up with a message from Jackson. It was brief, but it gave her exactly what she needed to hear. Backup is 15 minutes away. Stay put. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Daniels was relentless, but so was she. Backup's on the way, Tara said, her voice steady but urgent. We just need to stay low until they get here. Mitchell gave a tight nod, though he still looked on edge. I just hope they get here before Daniels does. Tara didn't respond. She knew Mitchell was right to be worried. Daniels wouldn't let her escape without a fight. To him, she wasn't just an obstacle. She was a threat that needed to be eliminated. He wouldn't rest until she was silenced for good. The quiet of the night was suddenly interrupted by the faint sound of an approaching engine. Mitchell's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the side mirror. You hear that? He whispered. Tara tensed, straining to listen. The sound was growing louder, and her stomach twisted with anxiety. Was it backup, or had Daniels already found them? Mitchell leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. I don't like this, he muttered. We're too exposed out here. Tara's pulse quickened as she strained to see through the gloom. The distant rumble of an engine grew more distinct, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Daniels had caught up to them, there was no telling what he would do. We need to move, Mitchell said urgently, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Tara's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't afford to sit around and wait to find out who was coming. Mitchell slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, speeding out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Tara glanced over her shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. Her hands clenched into fists as she silently prayed that backup would arrive soon. As they raced down the deserted road, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Daniels was closing in, and time was slipping away. Mitchell veered onto a side road, the car jolting over the uneven pavement. They were deep in the rural outskirts now, surrounded by dense woods and eerie silence. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. We're heading into the middle of nowhere. Mitchell shook his head, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. It's better than waiting around for Daniels to find us. At least out here we have a chance. Tara wasn't convinced, but she knew they didn't have many options. They needed to buy time until Jackson's team arrived, and staying on the move was the only way to avoid being cornered. As they drove deeper into the woods, the narrow road became even more treacherous. The car bounced and jolted over potholes and cracks in the pavement, and Tara clung to the door, trying to steady herself. Suddenly, the sound of another engine echoed through the night, and her heart leapt into her throat. She turned to Mitchell, eyes wide with alarm. He's found us, she whispered. Mitchell's face paled. Without hesitation, he pressed harder on the gas, the car surging forward as they sped down the dark road. Tara's pulse pounded in her ears as headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer with every passing second. Hold on, Mitchell muttered, his voice tense. He swerved onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The headlights behind them were closing in fast, and Tara knew they were running out of options. The car swerved violently as they raced down the winding path, and Tara's heart hammered as she gripped her seat, praying they could outrun whoever was chasing them. Mitchell's grip tightened on the wheel as the road twisted and turned through the dense forest. The headlights behind them cast long, eerie shadows that flickered across their path, making the dark woods seem even more ominous. Whoever that is, they're not giving up, Mitchell muttered, his voice edged with panic. Tara glanced at the side mirror, her pulse quickening as the car behind them gained ground. The glaring headlights sliced through the darkness, closing in on them like a predator stalking its prey. She couldn't see the driver, but she didn't need to. Could only be one person, Daniels. He's relentless, Tara said through gritted teeth, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. But we can't let him catch us. Not now. Mitchell nodded, his expression grim as he pushed the car even harder. The engine groaned in protest as they tore down the winding road, the tires screeching as they rounded each sharp curve. The trees loomed closer on either side, and the road seemed to narrow with every passing mile. "We're going to lose him," Mitchell said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Tara wasn't so sure. Daniels had already proven he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was her. She could feel the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a suffocating force. He wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was a man who thrived on power and control. And right now, she was the one thing standing in his way. Up ahead, the road suddenly split into two paths. Mitchell made a split-second decision, veering sharply to the left. The car lurched sideways, and Tara grabbed the dashboard to steady herself. The headlights behind them flickered for a moment before reappearing, now following the same path they had taken. "Damn it!" Mitchell cursed under his breath. "He's still on us." Tara's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun Daniels forever, especially not on these back roads. They needed another way out, and fast. "We can't just keep driving," Tara said, urgency tightening her voice. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to do something." Mitchell shot her a quick, skeptical glance. "Like what? We're out in the middle of nowhere." Tara's eyes flickered to the forest on either side of the road. The trees were thick and shadowed, their branches weaving together like an impenetrable wall. It wasn't the safest option, but it was all they had. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods." Mitchell looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Into the woods? Are you serious?" Tara nodded, her heart pounding. "It's our best shot. Daniels won't be able to follow us through the trees. We can lose him." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as the car behind them crept closer. Then, taking a deep breath, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." He swerved the car to the side of the road, skidding to a stop just as the headlights of the pursuing vehicle loomed behind them. Tara didn't waste a second. She flung open the passenger door and leapt out, her feet hitting the gravel with a sharp crunch. Mitchell was right behind her, slamming his door shut as they bolted toward the dense line of trees. The forest was dark and foreboding, but Tara didn't care. They needed to disappear fast. The screech of tires as the other car came to a sudden halt echoed through the night, making Tara's pulse spike. They were running out of time. "Come on," she whispered urgently, grabbing Mitchell's arm and dragging him into the shadows of the trees. Thick branches overhead blocked out what little light remained, plunging them into near-total darkness. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, tangled with roots and thick underbrush that made it difficult to move quickly. But Tara refused to slow down. A car door slammed in the distance, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. Daniels was coming. Mitchell stumbled behind her, struggling to keep up as they weaved through the trees. His breathing was ragged, and Tara could tell he was starting to panic. But stopping wasn't an option. "We need to keep moving," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "If he finds us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew exactly what would happen if Daniels caught them. They had seen firsthand what he was capable of, and neither of them wanted to face it again. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Tara's stomach twisted with fear. Daniels was too close, too close. They had to find a way out or at least somewhere to hide. "Over here," Mitchell whispered hoarsely, grabbing her arm and pointing to a thick cluster of bushes up ahead. Tara didn't hesitate. She ducked behind the bushes, pulling Mitchell down with her. The branches scraped against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her entire focus was on the approaching footsteps, each one sending a fresh wave of dread coursing through her veins. They crouched in silence, barely daring to breathe as the footsteps drew nearer. Tara's heart pounded so loudly she was afraid it would give them away. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was standing just feet away. The soft rustle of leaves under their boots was the only sound in the still night. Tara's mind raced. What if Daniels had already spotted them? What if he was just toying with them, drawing out the moment before he struck? Beside her, Mitchell trembled slightly, and she silently prayed he would stay quiet. For what felt like an eternity, they remained frozen in place, waiting. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed, this time moving away. Tara let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "He's going the other way," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, though her body remained tense. Daniels might have moved on for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up so easily. They were far from safe. "We can't stay here," she murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to keep moving." Mitchell hesitated, then gave a short nod. Together, they slowly rose to their feet and began making their way deeper into the woods, their footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. The night stretched on, the weight of Daniel's pursuit hanging over them like a storm cloud. Tara knew they couldn't keep running forever, but for now, all they could do was stay one step ahead. As they trudged deeper into the forest, their breaths came shallow and quick. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Even though they had evaded Daniels for the moment, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trees seemed to close in around them as they moved farther from the road. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and tangled undergrowth that made each step a challenge. Tara's legs ached, but she forced herself to keep going. Stopping wasn't an option, not while they were still being hunted. Mitchell stumbled beside her, his face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. His breathing was heavy, and Tara could tell he was struggling to keep up. She slowed her pace slightly, glancing at him with concern. "You okay?" she whispered, barely audible. Mitchell nodded, though his expression was grim. "Yeah, just trying to catch my breath." Tara knew he was exhausted, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Not while Daniels was still out there, searching for them. "We have to keep moving," she said softly, scanning the darkness around them. "We need to find a place to hide until we can come up with a plan." Mitchell didn't argue. He simply nodded and kept walking, though his steps were slower, more labored. Tara's mind raced as they pressed on, trying to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay in the forest forever. They couldn't go back to the road either. Daniels would be waiting, and she had no doubt he was even more determined to catch them now. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped in his tracks, his hand shooting out to grab Tara's arm. She turned to him, her heart leaping into her throat. "What was it?" she whispered urgently. Mitchell didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pointed ahead, his eyes wide with alarm. Tara followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, she didn't see anything, but as her eyes adjusted to the pale moonlight, she noticed the silhouette of a building in the distance. It was an old cabin, its wooden frame barely visible through the dense trees surrounding it. The windows were dark, and the roof sagged slightly, as though the structure had been deserted for years. But it was shelter, temporary at least, and right now that was all they needed. "Come on," Tara said softly, pulling Mitchell's arm. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously toward the cabin, their footsteps nearly soundless on the forest floor. As they approached, Tara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. The cabin appeared abandoned, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Daniels was still out there, and the last thing they needed was to walk straight into a trap. They reached the front of the cabin, and Tara carefully tried the door. It creaked loudly as it swung open, the sound echoing through the quiet night. She winced but quickly pushed the door open wider, gesturing for Mitchell to follow her inside. The interior of the cabin was just as run down as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The furniture, what little there was old and battered, the wood splintered and cracked from years of neglect. A musty smell filled the air, and the floor creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. Tara shut the door behind them, her eyes scanning the room for anything useful. There wasn't much, just a few broken chairs and a table that looked like it might collapse any second. But at least they had walls around them now, some semblance of protection. "We can stay here for a bit," Tara said, though she wasn't entirely convinced it was a good idea. "Just until we figure out what to do next." Mitchell nodded, sinking onto one of the broken chairs with a sigh of relief. He wiped a hand across his forehead, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. "This place gives me the creeps," Mitchell muttered, glancing around the room. "But I guess it's better than being out there." Tara agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. Her instincts told her to stay alert, but she didn't want to panic. They were already on edge, and the last thing they needed was fear taking over. "We'll be fine," Tara said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We just need to rest for a bit. Then we'll figure out our next move." Mitchell nodded again, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Tara couldn't blame him. Everything about this situation felt wrong, and it seemed like no matter what they did, they were always one step behind. Tara moved toward one of the windows, carefully pulling back the tattered curtain just enough to peer outside. The forest stretched out before them, dark and forbidding. She couldn't see any sign of Daniels, but that didn't mean he wasn't out there. "We have to leave soon," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mitchell. "We can't stay here for long." Mitchell looked up at her, his expression tired but determined. "What's the plan? We can't just keep running forever." Tara sighed, letting the curtain fall back into place. "I don't know yet, but we can't go back to the road. Daniels will be waiting for us." Mitchell frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "What if we try to reach the nearest town? There's got to be one nearby." Tara shook her head. "It's too risky. If Daniels finds us before we get there, we're done for." Silence settled between them as they both contemplated their next move. Tara's mind raced, trying to come up with a solution, but nothing seemed right. Every option felt dangerous, and the thought of confronting Daniels again made her stomach churn. Suddenly, the sound of a twig snapping outside broke the silence, and Tara's heart leapt into her throat. She exchanged a panicked glance with Mitchell, her pulse quickening. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, her body going rigid as she strained to listen. There was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the trees outside the cabin. Daniels was here. Tara's heart raced as she pressed her back against the wall of the cabin, straining to hear the footsteps outside. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through her, tightening her chest. She motioned for Mitchell to remain quiet, her finger to her lips. His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was as if they knew exactly where Tara and Mitchell were and were taking their time getting to them. Tara's mind raced with thoughts of what Daniels would do if he found them. He had already made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to use force, and there was no telling how far he would go to protect himself now. Tara's hand instinctively went to her waistband, where her FBI-issued firearm was hidden. She had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of their escape. She didn't want to use it. Violence wasn't her first choice, but if it came down to protecting herself or Mitchell, she wouldn't hesitate. The sound of the footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. Tara held her breath, her body tense, waiting for the next move. A few agonizing moments passed in silence. Then there was a loud bang as the door swung open, crashing against the wall with a force that made the entire cabin shake. Tara's heart skipped a beat as she and Mitchell flattened themselves against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. She could hear the sound of heavy boots stepping inside, slow and purposeful. Her pulse quickened, every instinct in her body telling her to run. But there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. "Tara." Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale with terror. "What do we do?" Tara shook her head, her hand tightening around the grip of her weapon. "Stay quiet," she mouthed. "Don't move." The figure in the doorway stood for a moment, surveying the room. Tara could hear his shallow breathing, and her mind instantly recognized the pattern. It was Daniels. She had heard his voice and seen his face enough times to know it was him. But why was he moving so slowly? Was he toying with them, enjoying their fear? Come out! Come out! Wherever you are, Daniels mocked, his voice dripping with malice. You can't hide forever, Agent Lawson. Tara felt a chill run down her spine at the sound of his voice. He knew she was there. There was no point in hiding anymore. Slowly, Tara inched toward the corner, her back still pressed against the wall, her weapon now drawn but concealed behind her. She needed to stay calm, stay smart. Mitchell's breathing grew heavier, and Tara could feel his panic rising. She glanced at him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. They had to remain strong. They couldn't let fear take control. Daniels took another step into the cabin, his flashlight beam scanning the room. You thought you could run from me? He sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. You thought you could get away after what you did. Tara's mind raced. What was he talking about? What had she done? She had only been doing her job, investigating the case, and yet here she was, hunted like a criminal. I know you're in here, Daniels continued, his voice growing louder. I can smell your fear. Why don't you make this easy on yourself and come out? You know this isn't going to end well for you. Tara's grip on her gun tightened. She could feel its weight in her hand, offering her a small sense of control in a situation that felt completely out of her hands. But she had to be careful. One wrong move and things could escalate in a way she couldn't recover from. She peeked around the corner just enough to catch a glimpse of Daniels. He was standing in the middle of the room now, his flashlight illuminating the dust-filled air around him. His expression was cold, emotionless, as if he were going through the motions of a routine traffic stop, rather than hunting down a fellow law enforcement officer. Tara's mind raced with possibilities. She could confront him now, use her FBI credentials to try and de-escalate the situation. But would that work? Daniels didn't seem to care about her authority. In fact, he seemed to relish the fact that he had her in such a vulnerable position. He had already shown no respect for her as an agent or as a person. Suddenly, Mitchell shifted beside her, his foot brushing against a loose floorboard. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the cabin, it was enough to draw Daniels' attention. What was that? Daniels snapped, whipping around toward the source of the noise. Tara's heart sank as she realized they had been discovered. There was no more time to hide, no more time to plan. She had to act now or things would only get worse. Taking a deep breath, Tara stepped out from behind the wall, her gun still hidden at her side. Daniels, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. It's over. You need to stop this. Daniels' eyes widened in surprise for a brief moment before his expression darkened. Tara Lawson, he said, his voice low and menacing. I knew you'd show yourself eventually. Tara held up her free hand, trying to keep things calm. This doesn't have to go any further. Let's just talk. Talk? Daniels scoffed, stepping closer. You think I'm interested in talking after everything you've done? Tara frowned, confused. What are you talking about, Daniels? What did I do? Daniels sneered, his grip tightening on the baton in his hand. You think you can just come into my town and start digging into things that don't concern you? You think you can poke around in my business and just walk away? Tara's eyes narrowed. So that was it. This wasn't just about a routine investigation. Daniels had something to hide, and her probe had gotten too close to exposing it. I was just doing my job, Tara said, her voice firm. You can't keep running from this. Sooner or later, the truth will come out. Daniel's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Tara thought he might actually attack her. But instead, he took a deep breath, his expression once again turning cold. You don't know what you're dealing with, Agent Lawson, he said quietly. But you will soon enough. Before Tara could respond, Daniels lunged at her, his baton raised high. Tara reacted on instinct, ducking just in time to avoid the blow. She spun around, her gun now fully drawn. But before she could fire, Daniels grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until the gun slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Mitchell shouted in alarm, rushing toward Daniels to help. But Daniels was too quick. With a swift motion, he shoved Tara to the ground, turning to face Mitchell with a deadly glare. Tara lay on the floor, stunned and weak after Daniels had pushed her down. The cabin's dim light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls as she tried to regain her composure. Mitchell stood nearby, his hands raised in a futile attempt to protect himself as Daniels loomed over him. Tara's mind raced, searching for a way out of this terrifying situation. Daniels had stripped her of her weapon, but she still had her training and quick thinking. She needed to use both to survive. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. With a sudden burst of energy, Tara rolled away from Daniels, trying to put some space between them. Her heart raced in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes scanning the room for any possible weapons or tools she could use. Daniels, momentarily surprised by Tara's resilience, growled in frustration. "You're a tough one, aren't you? But this ends now." Tara could see Mitchell's eyes dart nervously between her and Daniels. He was clearly frightened, but he was also trying to figure out how to assist her. Tara had to act fast. She couldn't afford to wait for Daniels to make the next move. As Daniels advanced toward her, Tara's gaze landed on a heavy metal pipe lying in a corner of the cabin. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. She dashed toward it, grabbing it just as Daniels lunged at her again. With a swift swing, Tara knocked him back, giving herself a few precious seconds to think. Daniels stumbled but quickly regained his balance, his rage evident. "You think a pipe is going to stop me? You've got another thing coming." Despite his bravado, Tara noticed a hint of hesitation in Daniel's movements. Maybe he was beginning to realize that she wasn't going to be as easy to handle as he thought. Tara took advantage of this brief moment, her mind racing with strategies. "Mitchell, stay back," Tara shouted, her voice urgent. "I need you to stay out of this. Find help." Mitchell hesitated for a second, clearly torn between staying and running. But seeing the determination in Tara's eyes, he nodded and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. Tara's focus returned to Daniels. He was recovering from the blow she had dealt, but his anger seemed to grow with each passing second. Tara needed to use his fury against him. If she could make him underestimate her, she might find an opening to gain the upper hand. As Daniels approached again, Tara's movements were deliberate and controlled. She swung the pipe defensively, keeping Daniels at bay. Her training had taught her how to handle confrontations like this, but dealing with someone so unhinged was a different challenge. "Why are you doing this, Daniels?" Tara demanded, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "What's your endgame?" Daniels snarled, his face twisted with hatred. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? You FBI agents, you think you can come into my town and dig into things that don't concern you. You think you're above everyone else." Tara could see the venom in his eyes, and it was clear that this was more than just a personal vendetta. Daniels had something to hide, and her investigation had touched a nerve. But it was too late for explanations. Tara needed to stay focused on the immediate threat. Daniels lunged again, but this time Tara was ready. She sidestepped his attack and swung the pipe once more, making contact with his arm. Daniels roared in pain, clutching his arm as he staggered back. Tara seized the opportunity, moving quickly to disarm him. With a well-aimed strike, she knocked the baton from his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. Tara moved to grab it, but Daniels wasn't finished yet. He lunged at her, his desperation clear. Just as Daniels reached her, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Tara's heart leaped with hope. Help was on the way. The sound grew louder, and Daniel's expression shifted from anger to panic. He realized his time was running out. "You're finished," Tara said, her voice resolute. "The police are coming." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door. For a moment, it looked like he might try to flee, but then he turned back to Tara, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You haven't heard the last of me." Before Tara could respond, Daniels turned and fled out the back door of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. Tara wasted no time. She grabbed the baton and checked to make sure Mitchell was safe. The sound of sirens grew closer, and Tara could see flashing lights through the windows. She sighed with relief as the first police cars arrived, their lights cutting through the cabin's darkness. Officers rushed in, their faces a mixture of concern and determination. "Agent Lawson?" One of the officers called out, his voice filled with recognition. "Are you okay?" Tara nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I'm fine, but we need to find Daniels. He's dangerous and armed." The officers quickly took charge, spreading out to search for Daniels. Tara watched as they moved with precision and urgency. She knew Daniels wouldn't get far. The police were determined and well-equipped. With Tara's description, they had a good chance of catching him. As the officers worked, Tara's thoughts turned to Mitchell. He was safe, but the trauma of the night would linger. Tara knew this was a night neither of them would ever forget. The cabin, once a place of fear and danger, now felt like a sanctuary. Tara was grateful for the help that had arrived, but she also knew the fight wasn't over. Daniels was still out there, and the case was far from closed. For now, though, Tara took a deep breath and allowed herself a moment of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the fight for justice was only just beginning. If you like this story, make sure to like and subscribe for a part 2. Also, to help strengthen our community, I'd like to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are.